We come today to a presentation. I hate to call them lectures. The presentation is labeled Vision 10. And for those who are taking this education in order, you realize that this is not only the 10th presentation in a row on the subject of vision, but that vision, in addition to being a subject, and quite different from just being a subject, is a phase of our growth. And that phase corresponds to the development of consciousness. That there is a moment when one becomes conscious of being conscious. We might say in a very popular way that before being conscious that we are conscious, before being self-conscious, that we have an awareness. And that, for instance, little tiny children are very similar to animals. They have this kind of uncanny awareness. But there comes a point in a little tiny child that does not occur in an animal. No matter how well-trained the dog, no matter how seductive the dolphin, no matter how playful the primate, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, they never have a moment of stepping to a higher order, of suddenly making a transition, of making a shift, where they are distinctively different in that what they engender after that is a quality that we would call presence. There comes a moment where a little tiny child stands up and looks at you, and you see that they intend to see you, that they are there seeing you, and you recognize that all human beings are capable of this higher order, a kind of a presence. And in order to give ourselves some kind of a distinguishing language, which can be very useful, I would like to define presence as a window in existence. Presence is a window in existence through which we can see that there is another aspect to our world. There is a world outside, a world outside of us, or that in some way, if you turn that inside out, that we have abstracted ourselves from the world. It can go either way. Ever after that, there is a concern in awareness for those moments of self-consciousness initially don't last very long. They're there briefly, and then the child goes back to play, and is just a child again. Is at home among the animals again. But ever after that, those moments repeat themselves with varying frequency and duration. And then there comes a time in adolescence where the human being begins to get more power, more what the Greeks called energeia. And it changes the whole dynamic. Dynamis is a movement of energeia. Energeia is a quantification, an order, a voltage, whereas dynamic is an amperage. It's a movement. And there comes a time in adolescence where we recognize that suddenly our psychophysical energy is much more than our body in its old awareness can handle. And the normal response is a kind of a fidgeting, an anxiety, a clumsiness. One is no longer at home among the animals. One has to reach out extra to maintain that. And as adolescence matures, as that energy begins to course, we find that it's easier and easier for us to try to retreat into an abstraction in order to understand rather than to participate in the world. This quality of presence then becomes somewhat problematical, and in fact becomes detrimental if there isn't some kind of bridging that goes on. And anyone who has raised an adolescent, even just one, realizes the ongoing struggle to keep the bridges alive as adolescence goes. And by the time of 18, 19 years of age, in high adolescence, the human being simply has too much psychophysical energy for any kind of bridging except those that they choose to accept. And in moments where they will accept it. And everything after that, one has to very delicately ask permission for anything. That new level is the introduction of the dimension of consciousness into space and time. And as long as we are like young, at home among the animals, simply aware, space and time are all the context that we need to keep track of. But as soon as self-awareness, as consciousness comes into play, as soon as it becomes really a definite ongoing factor, like in adolescence, it has to be taken into consideration. And instead of living in a three-dimensional space with a fourth dimension of time, we live in a five-dimensional context that includes consciousness everywhere, and it has to be factored both into space and to time, but especially into time-space. So much so that one of the classic discoveries in the 1920s in nuclear physics, the students of Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, and Heisenberg both came to realize that in the mathematical equations of what happens to subatomic particles, that consciousness as a dimension definitely affects the outcome in four-dimensional space-time of subatomic particles. Hence the famous uncertainty principle. That you, as an observer, can factor your consciousness into time, or you, as an observer, can factor your consciousness into space, but you, as an observer, cannot factor your consciousness into both space and time at the same time. This uncertainty principle points up to a major flaw in the structure of education, in the structure of Western civilization, into the operating, acceptable psychology of human beings in the West. Because there's no difficulty whatsoever of factoring the fifth dimension of consciousness into a four-dimensional time-space continuum in many disciplines in Asia. There's no difficulty whatsoever. The master yogi has no difficulty in working with a five-dimensional continuum to an accuracy of whatever is necessary. The Zen master laughs at the conundrum of the complications of a Western person who cannot somehow factor consciousness into time and space at the same time. And one of the recursive developments of this is that masters of psychotherapy who really knew their craft, knew the practice of psychotherapy, had tens of thousands of patients over hundreds of thousands of hours. Someone, say, like Carl Jung, In the collected letters of Carl Jung, published by Princeton University Press, Volume 2, there's a letter in 1942 from Jung to another psychiatrist where he observes a curiosity that whenever he applied psychoanalysis to someone of Chinese origin, they apparently had no subconscious. They had no unconscious. We're not talking about master yogis. We're not talking about Zen masters. We're talking about someone who comes from a different civilization. A civilization where apparently the split between time and space, which for modern Western human beings extends to the unfactorability of consciousness into both simultaneously. And here we need to catch ourselves. It's not so much that consciousness for the Western person doesn't factor into time and space instantly and equally, but that one cannot measure that five-dimensional continuum with a Western rule. There is no quantification in the Western scientific tradition that is able to be applied. There's no technology for that kind of presence. For indeed, we see all the time men and women in the West. I can name you several thousand examples of men and women who factored consciousness into time-space without any difficulty whatsoever. They're usually labeled mystics. They're usually labeled artists. Sometimes they're labeled mad scientists. They're not concerned, or rather in the past they were not concerned, with any kind of measurability. One of the precarious thresholds of truth for us in the 21st century will be, can it be translated into mathematics? Is there a mathematical expression for it? And if there is not, if it is not capable of being mathematically expressed, it will be put in some kind of suspension at best. Now this education, no matter how far out it goes or seems, all of it is factorable into mathematical language. All of it can be expressed. But the expression taxes the current capacity, because the current capacity is limited by an educational system that is late medieval at best. The educational system is at least 500 years behind the time. It makes a quality of mind that would have been at home in 1500, but was not at home already in 1600, and certainly isn't at home in the year 2000. It's completely out of date. So this kind of an education requires, first of all, that when you come into its play, that you allow yourself to suspend judgment for a while. Suspend the education that you have for a while. For it's not the usual animal. And if you look for distinguishing marks of the usual animal, the usual educational animal, you won't find them. And being so disappointed very often, your attention will stray. You'll think that nothing is going on, that there's no object there to see. And this drifting of attention is a regression back into an infantile awareness level, where you're more interested in the ambient temperature than in the characterizing gestalts of language. So this is like a litmus test. If you find yourself drifting, it's not a question of paying attention so you can understand what's being said, but just to catch yourself up from the drifting so that at least you're present. Because as long as you are present and not simply aware, the language that's being used will evoke from you enough juices that later on you'll be able to digest whatever you need to. No one needs to understand everything. All we need is enough understanding to be able to acquaint ourselves with the coordinates of a new kind of complexity and the fundamentals of navigating in that kind of realm. Now, we can go very far afield. We can get into books like this one that came out in 1994, sold out in a few months. They reprinted in 1996. Thinking in Complexity: The Complex Dynamics of Matter, Mind, and Mankind. One can go into 21st century type books as Quantum Networks: Dynamics of Open Systems. One can even go to something like the Santa Fe Institute, 1992, Lectures in Complex Systems. I arranged a whole précis for you of this volume. But in fact, these kind of late 20th century, early 21st century ways of thinking have roots and origins, and I want to show you two origins today. Then we'll get back to the subject matter for our course and develop that. The first root takes place about 400 years ago. It takes place in 1609, and at that time, a book came out, and it wasn't translated into English until 1992, Johannes Kepler's New Astronomy. And the New Astronomy is the bridge between Copernicus and Newton. Between Copernicus, who said that the old medieval idea of the earth being the center of the universe could not possibly be, that correct thinking and correct computation clearly showed that the universe was sun-centered, that the sun was the center and the earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. Newton was famous for 3 laws of thermodynamics that led to the development of the application of a new kind of universal language, a language for calculating infinitesimal differences. And because it was a principle of calculating, the language was called calculus. That one could calculate the infinitesimal differences between 1 and 0 and between 0 and 1. And once you were able to calculate infinitesimal differences between those two limits, between 1 and 0 and 0 and 1, you could apply that to any numbers, no matter how large. In between Copernicus and Newton, the only way that you can get from a sun-centered universe to a Newtonian universe where one can begin to calculate infinitesimally accurate figures and numbers, the only possible bridge is Kepler. Not Galileo, but Kepler. Galileo develops the headline news because he makes a telescope where he can see that one of the stars actually is a planet named Jupiter, and that it has 4 little moons that go around it. 4 little moons that don't go around the sun. That even if the sun was the center, as Copernicus said, where the earth goes around the sun, and the moon goes around the sun, and all the other planets go around the sun, nevertheless, one can visually see through Galileo's little telescope that Jupiter has 4 little moons that go around it and not around the sun. And so out of this came the Galilean version of the Copernicus system. So Galileo is a deep improvement upon Copernicus. And in that sense, one can say Galileo was a bridge between Copernicus and Newton. But the fact is that Galileo is a deep modification of Copernicus, whereas Kepler is a radical revolution. Kepler's book, The New Astronomy, means new astronomy, astronomica nova, new. That Copernicus was not right enough to modify, that it had to be completely redone from scratch. Because Kepler was the first person to develop a mathematical expression linked to experimental observations that were accurate enough that he could see through the telescope and on the page, coordinated at the same time in his mind, that he could see that the orbit of Mars around the sun was never circular. That part of the whole sense of truth of the ancient system of Ptolemy, that there were circles and spheres, and Copernicus, that it was the sun that was the center of these spheres, but nevertheless the spheres and circles were perfect. God had made a perfect universe. And Galileo agreed with that. It was Kepler who was the first person to be able to express and show, both on the page in terms of mathematics and through the telescope in terms of minute observations by the thousands. Not that Kepler had made them, but Kepler, one of Kepler's teachers, had made them. A man famous in scientific history, his name is Tycho Brahe. One of the biggest craters on the moon is named Tycho, in honor of him. Tycho was a rambunctious kind of a character. He lived in Denmark in a rowdy age. He lost the tip of his nose in a bar fight, so he had a metallic nose. And because of his fantastic bravado and character and his torrential, accurate genius, he talked the Danish royalty into giving him a special island off Denmark, where he made a cosmic city that he planned out himself, Uraniborg, the great primordial city, and at the center of this island he built an observatory for himself. And he had this great, huge curve of metal made that had all kinds of measurements on it, like some huge sextant, in which he lay himself and sighted along his metallic nose. And he kept accurate, egotistical records of his observations of God's world. And he came in possession of this fantastic archive of accurate observations of all the planets over years and years and years. But it was Kepler who came to probably sweep out the office, who looked at these observations and began to plot them out so that in a dutiful way he could show the beautiful circularity of God's world in terms of mathematics. Only the closer he got to being able to do that, the more the circles squashed themselves into ellipses. And in the New Astronomy, towards the end, after beating around the bush for a long time, after about 500 pages of beating around the bush, Kepler finally came out with the fact that there was no doubt whatsoever that the orbit of Mars was not a circle, that it was an ellipse. And the only thing that could account for this was that this ellipse of the planet Mars showed that there was not a single center to the cosmos, but it had to have a paired center. It had to have two center points, that the orbit of Mars somehow showed that Mars and the sun were in an interrelationship, and that if one looked for a center to the universe, it would be a point in space, that the sun moved around that point in space very close to it, and Mars very far away from it, but nevertheless both of them moved around a point in space. And it was Kepler in the New Astronomy that finally showed that if one looks at a star system with accuracy, every aspect of that star system rotates itself around an axis in pure space. That there's no physical or physiological center whatsoever, but that there is a dynamic, transcendental, invisible center that operates as if it were there. That its effect is as if it were a material center. That there is an axis, a pole, like a magnetic pole, which is not graspable as material, but is certainly graspable by the mind as a mathematical certainty, and then confirmable by observations of the perturbations and the actions of all of the rotating elements. When Kepler came out in 1609 with the new astronomy, the place in all the world that was listening with the largest ears and the keenest minds was London, England. And in the city of London, of all the people listening, the keenest of all the minds, the largest of all the ears were those of Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was the most present, the most consciously integrated of all human beings of his time. If you tried to put it on a scale, you would have to go to some asymptotic exclamation mark. A brief comparison: the modern average person who reads a newspaper has a working vocabulary of 5,000 words. Shakespeare's working vocabulary was 50,000 words 400 years ago. One sees in the plays of Shakespeare a spike in his productive genius. The very last play that he wrote is called The Tempest, and it's about a magician, Prospero, who is in exile to an island, who is at the center of this island himself. Shakespeare locates the island not off Denmark, but in the Western Hemisphere, in the New World. The island of Bermuda, in the New World. It's Prospero's private kingdom from which he sights the cosmos. And he knows that the cosmos is not laconically circular. It doesn't obey some kind of mechanistic, imperturbable divine law, but that there is a malleable quality to the dimension of the universe, and that one's consciousness is a factoring dimension in what happens, and therefore the super self-conscious individual is like a magician, like Prospero is a magician. He himself, in his natural stance, is but a man. But when he puts on his cloak and holds his staff and has his book, Prospero is a magician who can change nature. He is capable of something beyond the chemistry of nature. He is capable of something alchemical. He is capable of transformation of nature by adding his consciousness as a dimension to time and space, and by controlling his consciousness, he controls the forms of nature. And so Shakespeare's The Tempest is, in a way, a sequel to Kepler's New Astronomy. The Tempest came out in 1613, about 4 years later. Shakespeare wrote The Tempest when he was the head playwright in all the world. His company was called The King's Men. They worked for King James. In between The Tempest and the New Astronomy, one finds exactly in the center, between 1609 for Kepler and 1613 for Shakespeare, that's 4 years. So the middle would be 2 years, 1609 plus 2 makes 1611. And in 1611, the King James Version of the Bible came out. So in between Kepler's New Astronomy and Shakespeare's The Tempest, one has the King James Version of the Bible, which is the first great poetic version of the Bible since the original Greek. There never was, between the original Greek and Hebrew Old Testament, the New Testament in Greek, the Old Testament in Hebrew, there never was a presentation of that whole set of documents in a language that was spoken by men and women by the millions until the King James Version of the Bible, which made the Bible, Old Testament and New, both readable at the same time to an enormous population of people. In the 3 generations before 1611, only the elite in England used an educational system that taught their children in 3 different languages. They learned English, they learned Latin, and they learned Hebrew. Those 3 languages were the upper class learning for about 3 generations in England. And only a few learned Greek later on. Shakespeare says of himself that he had very little Latin and much less Greek. But he could read English better than anyone. And Shakespeare's Tempest discloses not only a kind of a resonance with the import of a colossal translation of the Bible, the Holy Bible seen as some kind of voice of God given to man, made in the image of God, so that the Bible was seen as some kind of language figure, some kind of language being, so that the Bible had a head. It had a torso, it had arms, it had legs. And if one could understand the esoteric anthropomorphic shape of the Bible as a whole, one could get the entire gestalt of God's message in a single universal symbol. That whereas certain people like Christopher Marlowe, who was also like Tycho Brahe, interested in bars and brawls and broads. And Marlowe was interested in what would zodiacal man look like. A man whose consciousness spanned the entire circuit of the zodiac. The zodiacal man, is very small compared to that anthropological cosmic man that the Bible is his template of his whole body. But even beyond that, Shakespeare goes to an impossible, transcendental realization. The zodiacal man is limited by the movement of the sun. It's only those constellations that the sun goes through. All the rest of the universe is left out. There are, from this particular planet, from the perspective of the 12 constellations of the zodiac, there are planet-wide 88 constellations. So if one were complete zodiacal man, you were an astrological phenomenon, you were all 12 signs at the same time, you would still not have 76 constellations taken care of. That's quite a gap. In terms of the biblical, anthropological man, you would have indeed the entirety of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But all of Asia would be left out, all of Africa, all of the primordial Americas, and probably leave out Antarctica, all the pagan millennia that came before that, All those men and women who hadn't understood that principle, and there wasn't but a few discerning Kabbalistic rabbis who ever took the time to try and see the Torah as the shape of a transcendental being, and there weren't but just a handful of Christian mystics who tried to take the New Testament, but there wasn't anyone who had taken the entire Old and New together. But Shakespeare went beyond even these kinds of mind-boggling, stretching prototypes. Instead of trying to blast his way with some fantastic kind of swashbuckling view, Shakespeare, like a true artist, saw that no matter what extent or what shape a cosmic entity would take or need to take in order for it to have an effect upon existence, it would have to have this rotational energy, this radial kind of dynamic, and that all of that would have to be positioned in some kind of an axis that went through him. And if one could concentrate one's sense of presence to the nth degree, one would have the center line of that architecture, no matter what it was. No matter what extent or what shape it was, one would have the center line. But Shakespeare found, in compacting himself, in putting himself into this kind of a concentration, and his form of yoga was to write his cycles of plays. By the time Shakespeare got to The Tempest, one of the great writers of the 20th century, William Faulkner, said that having written for about 30 years, he could understand why Shakespeare broke his pencil after writing The Tempest. That was it. One didn't need to go any further than that because he had embodied that center core, one might even call it that soul core, that soul-centered core of his eternal presence in The Tempest. In discovering this, Shakespeare saw all the way through the different levels of the history of drama, of the history of his art, the dramatic art of the play. Saw all the way back to the origins of drama. That the artistic form of drama had a limited history. It had someone who was there at the beginning, the first great playwright. And that first great playwright was Aeschylus. Aeschylus, who discovered by making the initial form of Greek tragedy, the classic form that came down and does come down, came down to Shakespeare, comes down to us as Greek tragedy. Aeschylus was the creator of it. And in Aeschylus's career as a dramatist, as an artist in this form, came to an apex near the end of his life. The last play that Aeschylus wrote was Prometheus Bound. And one could say, along with Faulkner, that Aeschylus broke his pencil after having written Prometheus Bound. You don't need to go any further. But one of the curiosities of history is that Aeschylus was so early, and there are so many revolutions in human civilization and culture in between, that all along the way, all of Aeschylus was lost except one school book that had 7 of his plays in it. And Prometheus Bound was, fortunately, one of the 7 preserved as a medieval school book, a textbook, to show monks how to use Greek language. And so the Prometheus Bound was saved. But Prometheus Bound, when Aeschylus wrote it, was a trilogy. Because all great Greek tragedies appeared in a trilogy. In fact, the only trilogy that we have from Aeschylus is the Oresteia, the Orestes trilogy. From Sophocles, we have another trilogy, the Theban trilogy. Oedipus Rex is part of that. But the Prometheus Bound is missing the two plays that follow it. Shakespeare's The Tempest is a sequel to Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus. The Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus ends with that mythological bringer of fire, of the fire of creation to man, who stole this spark from the gods and gave it to man so that man would outstrip the gods. The Prometheus Bound of Aeschylus ends in a giant storm. Those two plays that followed it are missing, but Shakespeare's Tempest begins with that storm. It begins where the Prometheus Bound leaves off. It begins with someone like Prospero who's in command of the magical power now raised to an nth degree. But that he suffers from a personal uncertainty as to when and how to use it. And so The Tempest by Shakespeare is volume 2 of Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound in a very real way. And this realization so impressed an English writer of a couple of 100 years later, Percy Shelley, that Shelley wrote the third play. Aeschylus had written Prometheus Bound, Shakespeare had written The Tempest, and Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound, the third play, showing that one can make an application of this tremendous conscious magic of being able to alchemically transform time-space, and with it all of nature, that one can have a quality of vision that's certain enough, a calibration of consciousness that's accurate enough that one will not produce monsters. Shelley's wife wrote the version of what happens when science goes astray, when consciousness produces a flawed Superman. That novel was Frankenstein, infinitely helped by Shelley himself. But in Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, at the very end, one finds a quality of conscious application that ends the trilogy. He has the Demogorgon speak to the audience, and he gives a spell, a conscious, transformative magic spell, that when the resistances become too much, when the complexity becomes staggering, on that day, you concentrate your presence. And here's what Shelley wrote. This is the day which down the void abysm at the earth-born's spell yawns for heaven's despotism, and conquest is dragged captive through the deep. Love, from its awful throne of patient power, in the wise heart, from the last giddy hour of dread endurance, from the slippery, steep, and narrow verge of crag-like agony, springs and folds over the world its healing wings. Gentleness, virtue, wisdom, and endurance. These are the seals of that most firm assurance which bars the pit over destruction's strength. And if with infirm hand eternity, mother of many acts and hours, should free the serpent that would clasp her with his length, these are the spells by which to reassume an empire over the disentangled doom. to suffer woes which hope thinks infinite, to forgive wrongs darker than death or night, to defy power which seems omnipotent, to love and bear, to hope till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates, neither to change nor falter nor repent. This, like thy glory, Titan, is to be good, great, and joyous, beautiful, and free. This alone is life, joy, empire, and victory. Let's take a break. I want to come back to two different varieties of synthesis that we're using. We use pairs of books. We're pairing Shakespeare's Tempest with Shelley's Prometheus Unbound at this particular time. We use them for a month. We use them for one lunar cycle. And then we set them aside and we use another pair of books, and so on and so on. So that the whole educational dynamic is engendered by these 2 feet, these pairs of books that we use together, coordinated. And I think I've mentioned before, I'll mention again. The book as a form of experience and information and mental forms and conscious templates is a form that's been around for 2,000 years. Before 2,000 years ago, there were no books. Before 2,000 years ago, there were only scrolls. And scrolls were only around for about 2,000 years. Before scrolls, there were little clay tablets that fit in the palm of the hand. So in classical Greece, when a philosopher who was a traditional wisdom teacher was teaching people who knew information and ideas in terms of scrolls, in order to get them to cinch their understanding, he would clasp his fist like this. Do you get it? And what this meant was the ancient tradition that you hold the form of writing in the palm of your hand. It was like hearkening back to the origins of written language as a wisdom. When we came into the era of using books, and the original word was codex, the word for this form in Greek is codex. When they used to try to cinch the argument, did you get it, they would again hold up the book or tap the book, Bible thumping. It goes back to the very origins of the form in which language as a written medium is a conscious use of intelligence. Spoken language, speech, has primordially as its operation the experience level of reality. But a written language has the visionary aspect of reality. You cannot read a written language without visualizing in the mind. When you're little, you're taught to make pictures in the mind out of the words. And when you're more mature, you're taught to make ideas in the mind out of the words. And if you get very far advanced, you don't have to have any pictures or any ideas. The words themselves can structure a conscious outlook. On that level, learning is an art. One of the greatest visual artists of the 20th century was the American photographer, Edward Weston, who recorded a lot of his wisdom in 2 day books. And you can buy the set of the day books of Edward Weston. And somewhere in the first volume of the Daybooks of Edward Weston, he says, composition is the strongest way of seeing. That when you really want to see into something, see into it so that you can see its structure, in order to change it if you wish, because if you change its structure, you have changed it. One used the composing eye. One uses the eye of the artist. And it takes a visionary context for the eye of the artist to operate in. It's naive to think that the artist uses an eye that's just perceptually accurate. He uses not only an eye that's perceptually accurate, but that the perception is already interiorized into very powerful conception. And that conception is fanned out into a visionary context. And only on the fourth level out of that does one come with this penetrating way of seeing into structure. In terms of the development of conscious application of such an intelligence, the hand becomes a completely new vehicle. Jacob Bernowski, in his series on the Ascent of Man, said that on the scientific level, the hand is the cutting edge of the mind. Because the very first thing that we start to transform is the way in which we experience the world in its malleable possibility. No one on the mythic level of just speech naturally develops the sense of possibility. The sense of newness, of possibility, of differentness belongs to differential consciousness and doesn't occur on the mythic tribal level at all. Tribes continue to live by tradition. Cultures live by the mythic integrity of keeping that horizon of experience and language consistent, so that the cycle of the mythology matches the cycle of nature. Otherwise, the people will die. But when you bring consciousness into play as an added dimension to time-space, you have to have a cycle of vision that works along with the cycle of myth, that works along with the cycle of nature. So that you read in the New Testament, you read in the Gospel of John, St. John, a very high-powered, artistic insight artist. He says, without vision, the people perish. Where do they perish? They don't die, but they regress back. They regress back to the tribal, cultural, mythic level where they cling to tradition like bats in the cave at night. And they're afraid to go out. And then you get caught into that regressive conundrum that was so classically illustrated by Franz Kafka. Kafka's little short story, The Mole. The mole who cowers in his little burrow, and he's afraid to go out because the world is filled with predators going to get him. But finally, hunger overpowers his fear, and under cover of night, he slinks out from his burrow, and he goes out, and he finds food, and he eats, and he comes back, and just before he goes into his hole, he stops, and he realizes that they're waiting for him now in the hole. If he goes in there, they're going to get him. And meanwhile, the sun begins to come up. This kind of regressive conundrum is the classic existential bind that so-called modern man finds himself. And modern man was indeed in an existential bind. But modern man is now 3 generations out of date. His anxiety of being bound doesn't have to remain. He was unbound a couple hundred years ago, minimally. What this education is doing is to show that there's a phase form development that occurs in reality, We come into that phase form development on the natural level. We're born into nature. And we grow up and develop through the ritual level, through the mythic level. All of us have developed through the symbolic level, or you wouldn't be able to understand a thing that I'm saying. And it's true that some of you who are new come in, you may not understand what I'm saying anyway. But you can acclimate your hearing, your ear, so that you can get it tuned. It only takes a couple of weeks, a couple of sessions, a couple of 2-hour sessions, maybe 4, 6 hours, and your mind has the capacity to retune itself to hear what someone is saying, that this is not a mythic language at all, but this is a visionary language. This is a language I'm speaking now, which belongs not in storytelling, like me telling the story of Kafka's Mole, which is something that anyone can hear, but the placing of that mythic story within a visionary language that's telling about the unfolding of conscious space-time, and that the unfolding of conscious space-time is a triple process, nature, myth, and vision, that when you have this triple process, you have such a rich ocean of possibility that the forms that come out of that ocean, the beings that crawl ashore out of that evolution, the structures that precipitate out of that solution are enormously complex. And the name of those forms, the name of those structures, is the spiritual person, the human person, as a form, but not as some kind of simple form, but as a very complex form. Hence, the whole configuration now, the development of studying complexity, because it turns out that human beings who operate in conscious time-space operate in complexity. But that complexity, different from simplicity, complexity does not adequately integrate. You can't make an improvement on complexity by integration alone. Complexity works by differentiation. And one has to bring the powers of integration and differentiation into a combine. One has to use them together. One has to lay on both kinds of hands. One that's able to grasp and one that's able to search. And it's only by grasping and searching in coordinatedness together that one gets a 5-dimensional continuum. One gets the ability to see structure in 5 dimensions. And one sees that the human person is minimally a 5-dimensional form. And if one looks for an analogy, one cannot find a very adequate analogy in nature unless one goes to very special conditions of nature. One goes to a crystal. The crystal in nature turns out to have those very special characteristics which are analogous to the human person. The crystal acts as a prism for whatever light energy is introduced to it. One can refine the crystal to make an actual prism, in which case one can take the natural sunlight of the planet and differentially project it out as the color spectrum. In fact, that was the very procedure that the young Isaac Newton used to change, to mature, to transform, to alchemically remake his personality. Newton, who was a youngster, was constantly being tutored by a mathematical genius named Isaac Barrow, who kept saying to this shy, scrawny, phobic little boy, Isaac Newton, that he was a doorway to an impossibly real, large universe, but that he refused to see it. He refused to let his mind open up, to be able to think in it. And so Newton began sitting in a darkened cave room with only a little aperture of sunlight coming in through a crack in the door. And he would put his prism right there in the crack in the door. And he would sit like some alchemical mole in his burrow, afraid to go out, and yet what came in was the sunlight through the prism would cast the spectrum of the colors of the rainbow on the opposite wall. And Newton began to experience and to interiorize and to think about it. And out of this came one of the world's greatest books called The Optics of Sir Isaac Newton. His great mathematical work that made calculus the focus of all science for a couple of hundred years was readable only by a few people at the time. But his book on optics influenced the entire civilization. Within 5 or 10 years of the publication of the Optics, you had poets writing in a style that had never been seen before. You had people like a Wordsworth writing about transcendental experiences looking at an old churchyard. You had, all of a sudden, the development in English poetry, such a fantastic array of genius, that one of the studies of this from a Newton-influenced standpoint is called the breaking of the circle. And that breaking of the circle was the breaking of an accepted tradition that went back to a medieval mindset that was good in medieval times. But in the 18th century, where you had the first stirrings of the industrial might of a New England, it wasn't very good to stay medieval. One had to break that circle. The circles that were broken a couple of hundred years ago, the circles, because Shelley comes out of that era of England. Shelley is the apex of that kind of genius of breaking that kind of circle by a Newtonian insight. Shelley's vision is the ultimate optics revolution. He sees that what needs to be broken is not just a circle of medieval English tradition, but an even larger, but no less constraining circle of civilization going back to the classical Greeks. That all the way back to the Aristotelian and Platonic origins of Western thought, all of this constitutes yet another circle of tradition. And whatever is true in that circle must survive the alchemical transformation. Whatever is still useful will occur again. But that one has to have the ability to occasionally erase the board in the mind and start fresh. Not start fresh in the sense of reducing oneself back to a baby, but starting fresh with all the added possibilities of a conscious time-space in possession of a focus called the person. The person is a prism of possibility, the full spectrum of possibility. And even 200 years ago on that level, you find a whole population of men and women gathered around this time frame. The time frame, Prometheus Unbound, is written in 1819. The beginnings of Shelley's experiment with this is around the 1810s in that period. And one finds at this time everywhere that one looks. It's called the Revolutionary Age. One finds a Beethoven at the very same time. One finds a Jefferson at the very same time. One finds a Napoleon at the very same time. Everywhere that one looks, on a certain strata of creativeness, of breaking the circle of the old. The French Revolution redated the calendar. They said this is year 1. Jefferson said that the whole development of the colonial experience in North America, including the presidencies of Washington and Adams, were all lumpable together as a prehistory, and that the revolution began in 1800 to make some kind of new form. Jefferson's own letters to Madison are that in history, one has always seen the development of new possibilities by a selected elite. What happens if you have a population of 4 or 5 million people who have equally that freedom of possibility? Who knows what forms of life will come out of that? And incidentally, at the same time, Jefferson's letters are to James Monroe, who was the ambassador to France when Napoleon was still in charge and Talleyrand was his Secretary of State, his minister. Jefferson's letters to Monroe are, we want to buy the rest of the North American continent, everything from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, and here's our offer. Here's the sum of money, and you can remind Napoleon that we have taken a census and that he has under 20,000 fighting men of French origin in North America, and that we are sending more than 20,000 men a month through the Cumberland Gap, and that he should come to terms now while the offer is still on the table. That's called the Louisiana Purchase. In order to stretch the medieval colonial mind that these little enclaves on the Atlantic Ocean are the reality of what's happening, to stretch it so it includes an entire continental mass, so that the geographical scale of measurement went off the graph. No one could even believe 3,000 plus miles. Jefferson, in his presidential office, used to have a collection of all kinds of artifacts that Lewis and Clark would send him, showing that indeed these places existed. They're wide open. This quality of vision is a part of an educational cycle, and the tradition of including it goes back at least 5,000 years, because the development of written language goes back that far. Before then, there was a very few esoteric persons who orally passed on what was then, I think we could call it today, a secret tradition. And we can see from the Ice Age caves, we can see the initiatory process. We can see the making of artistic images were a kind of a written language. And the positioning of these in places like Glasgow were indeed a learning center to take natural men and women and mature them to the point to where they could go into a cave, and in that complete darkness could strike a flint and make a light, and take that single light like some kind of Statue of Liberty in Paleolithic times, and hold that single stick of light up, and the iconography of transformation would be there on the walls of the cave in the way they are positioned as sets of initiatory design that hold their shape all the way through the Egyptian pyramids, all the way through the Gothic cathedrals, and emerge today in the kinds of symbolic designs that one goes through when one is looking at complexity, modern mathematical iconography of transformation. Vision was always considered the fifth quality, the quintessence of maturity, that nature gives you the four corners of wholeness, but that the quintessence is the center point. It's a center point that doesn't have to have anything there, but is the focus of the corners together. That the focus can be there, like Kepler in the New Astronomy showing the sun is not at the center, nor is the earth at the center. The center is a locus in space where the axis of the rotational energy finds its pole. We call that today, the term is a barycenter. And we know that wherever there are a pair of co-revolving centers, the barycenter in a mid-space between them, mid-space in terms of the momentum volumes, the sun being so much larger than the earth, the barycenter is very close to the sun. Nevertheless, it can be distinguished from it quite accurately. There are star systems, as we mentioned, like the nearest star system to us, Alpha Centauri, has a triple star. So the barycenter in the Centauri star system is not very near any of those three suns. And whatever planets there are needs to revolve around that barycenter. There are quadruple star systems. At least 50% of the stars in the known universe are multiple star systems. Are you going to have some kind of schizophrenic Copernican outlook and be satisfied with that? You see, it's ridiculous. The given educational maturity today is actually at least 5,000 years out of date. It never would have been accepted 5,000 years ago by those few who were privileged to go through a transformation. Because we have seen for ourselves that that point of transformation is not a physical point, just like the barycenter doesn't have to be a physical point. It's a center of a focus of forces. And in every transformational literature that we have, there are names for that center, for that focus of forces. For the Chinese, it's the Tao. In India, in yoga, it's called Bindu. We call it today a vanishing point. And we know from the development of Stephen Hawking's and Roger Penrose of thinking deeply about black holes, that black holes as vanishing points, as places where event horizons of time-space vanish from this known universe, that they are not just simply little prick points of void, but that they are massive and of different sizes and have enormous capacity such that two of them could collide and coalesce together and send out reverberational waves throughout the cosmos. We live in a realm of reality where all of this is not only true, but has been true forever. And so we're like little beggar animals trying to catch up with the scraps thrown off by a passing caravan if we remain in a naive state. We don't have to be throwaway scavengers at the trail end of somebody else's caravan. We can explore the real ourselves, individually or in groups of our own choice and own making, our own compositional design. And that's what this education is for. Because the third millennium, the next millennium, is wide open. No one has control of it. There are no groups that own it. They don't even understand that it's there. What's the summation of all of the recent work? That no one knows, because it is so wide open, because there are more dimensions than just 5. There are higher levels of consciousness that dwarf the simple consciousness of being conscious, that one has to move into realms. One is reminded of that beautiful statement of Robert Kennedy's one time, where he said, there are those who see the world and ask why, and then there are those who ask why not. and see a different world. It's also the difference between the old categorical imperative that comes from the rationalism of Immanuel Kant, who was a confrère of the age of Shelley and Beethoven and Jefferson and Napoleon. Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophic minds of all time. But he posited that the critical reality of the mind must be hemmed in, it must be limited, it must be given some kind of rational basis. And the basis is a moral law that before anyone does something, they must ask themselves, what if everyone did this? And if you will take the time to consider your actions in terms of what if everyone does this, very often you will not do this. In fact, more often than not, you will not do this. But distinct from that, a French philosopher, an existentialist of the late 20th century, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, said Kant's categorical imperative stinks because there's an existentialist imperative. One can ask a different question. One can ask, what if no one did this? And quite frequently the answer is, the universe will be minus a value. Be my guest. Try that possibility. Merleau-Ponty is a differential consciousness. Kant is an integral consciousness. Powerful, but there's a limitation. Whereas with someone like Merleau-Ponty, right away, one of the issues that came up for him was the question of the terrorism of history. That history in its traditional garb of limitation acts as if it were a terrorist against the new. And the possibilities, if they are not courageous, will very quickly cower and wither, like Kafka's mole. But that it's only a couple of steps to find oneself in an impossible conundrum, like Kafka's mole. You're afraid to go out and explore the world, and you're afraid not to at the very same time. Why live in that kind of fear? Why accept those kinds of inculcations, is what they really are. One of Jefferson's favorite phrases, you see it again and again in his reminders to himself, the world belongs to the living. Those forms that people who are dead now, that gave to us, were good for them in their lives. We have the right to review them, to modify, to reject, to create anew. Jefferson finally worked out in his old age that every 19 years, human beings ought to review what the body of laws were and junk most of them and begin again to find what do we want to save, and that this kind of generational revolution would be a good, healthy spring cleaning job for civilization. It's this kind of equality that an education like this seeks to explore. Not the quality of so much an ongoing revolution, but to see that that itself is a possibility and a realm where the possibilities are endless. There are no bounds whatsoever. So that one comes to understand finally, one can navigate only with the capacity of freedom. That freedom is not some kind of political ideal, which is the thought in the mind of someone who then makes it into a principle, but that it's the only realistic condition in differential consciousness. And that the ongoing flow of that process of envisioning that operates is a flow, is a temperament, is a quality that we know of as love. That love and freedom, rather than being ideals, are in fact navigational aspects of the flow of a differential consciousness in a real cosmos. These are not sentiments whatsoever, but they're actually mathematically determinable and expressible. We need to see that every kind of process, whether it's nature or myth or vision, and we'll see later this year that there's a fourth process known as history, that all four of these universal processes have a paired way of seeing time. If you see time in terms of its process flow, that's a continuous time. But if you see time in terms of its polarization, in order to make manifest forms that are more or less stable, that's a discrete time. And so time becomes discrete when it comes to objective form, but time is also capable of being continuous in its flow when it's process-oriented. So that the objective phase has a discrete polarity and the process phase has a flow continuity, and that both of these work together. But when one chooses the discrete time, very often the paradigm for visualization in that particular mode is geometry. So vision becomes geometrical of handling discrete objectivity, discrete time objectivity. But when one looks at continuous flow, vision doesn't allow itself a comfortability with geometry. Its mathematical structure is one of algebra. One deals with an algebraic progression. In late 20th century, one would call it genetic algorithms. It's the modulation of geometry and algebra together that make for a penetrative maturity of vision in our time. The ability to see not only into structure, but how that structure operates in the lifetime of its cycle. The most stable of all forms in the universe is the proton. The atomic proton is as stable as any piece of matter there is, but it has a finite lifetime. When you write it out mathematically, it's a very large number, many billions of years. But even every proton has a finite existence where finally its polarity breaks down. Its discrete time stability ends. And it returns back to the real, drops out of its stability. For spiritual life forms like ourselves, we can do that transformation through an educational cycle. And we can drop out of the objectivity of the mind. The body is objective in nature, but it's the mind that's the objective, discrete time form in experience. And just as the body can mystically dissolve so that one participates in nature in such a way that the body goes back into nature, the mind also can dissolve so that the experience stew out of which it precipitates itself, that the mind can go back into pure experience. But the mind can also dissolve itself 180 degrees the other way into that other process known as vision. The mind can become pure vision. And when it does so, there's a transformation. Instead of the mind then resurfacing out of experience as the body, if one goes back into experience, if one does a meditation, or one does a concentration, or one does a yoga, one does some kind of a centering so that one's mind dissolves back into the continuous flow of experience. And in that equanimity, one can resurface as one's body simply and purely. But the body as a natural occurrence, pure. In his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung talks about how he had experienced one time out of the deep immersion into his psychological experience that he came back out and the rock that he was sitting on was no different from him. He was the rock, and the rock was him. And they were objects in pure nature. They hadn't yet developed or evolved into a realm where there were human beings. And one can do that. John Muir, in one of his books on the Yosemite, talks about how he climbed over the face of El Capitan one time to look at the view, the great Yosemite Valley, one of the first men to ever do this. And he got so immersed that he was watching the sunset over the Yosemite Valley, and suddenly he realized that he was pretty far down, pretty far over the face of El Capitan, and it was getting dark. And he turned to scramble back up, and as he did so, he realized that he'd gotten completely exhausted by coming over, by clinging and holding on. And the effort physically to go back up was too much. And he was trapped there on the crest of El Capitan in the darkening. And suddenly he records himself in his book on the Yosemite. He said, "I let go of my desperation, and El Capitan absorbed me. And without an effort, I walked back up over the edge and stood at the top." It's a mystical participation in nature. The body is so natural in nature that exhaustion doesn't touch it. The mind also can come back, not only precipitate out of experience into the body, but it can also precipitate out of a visionary immersion into the person without an effort. And one stands clear of nature, objectively for the very first time. It's deeper than existence. Existence is extant. Ex meaning out from the stance, existence. Whereas the person who steps free from vision is ecstatic. Outside completely of the constraints of nature. Is a spiritual form, free, independent, able to participate and cooperate with nature for sure, but able also to explore other realms, supranatural realms, not unnatural realms, supranatural realms. And it's only then that the capacity of the independent, free person discovers that there's one more ocean in front of them, one more endless process with its storms and its seething, with its calmness, with its possibilities and perils, and that's the ocean of history. And to get to the other side of history is the big question of the 20th century. Mircea Eliade, in his great book on the eternal return, the last chapter is called The Terror of History. Like Merleau-Ponty's seeing that history becomes like a predator process that seeks to engulf the individual, even with all the spiritual capacities, and so that one has to find some way of navigating across yet another process. Successful though you were with nature and with the mythic ocean of experience, and even with differential conscious vision, one has yet one more ocean to cross, one more sea to learn to navigate in. And that, wouldn't you know, that just as there's a synchronicity, as there's an alignment that's unbelievably accurate all along the line, the ability of human beings to leave their home planet and go out into an infinite cosmos happens exactly at the same time that the ocean of history becomes a final challenge. The final frontier is not just the high frontier of the stars, it's at the same time that other shore of the ocean of history. You can't cross the ocean of stars until you deal with time in both its discrete and continuous flows, its historical modulation. And so the wild-eyed Paleolithic hunters of differential consciousness look up and for the very first time see out on the vast savanna predators that could demolish them quite easily, but if they hunt in groups, it's food. And so the learning of cooperating together in terms of these highfalutin differential conscious adventures is the task not only of the 21st century, but of the whole third millennium. It may take 1,000 years to learn how to do that right, but nobody's going to learn unless we start, because there aren't going to be any other generations if we don't start. That's what this is all about. Now, the right way to go about this is your way. There's no Kantian, categorical imperative that someone else can give you. All that one can do is give you their version of how they do it. You take that for what it's worth. You edit it in your own way. My way is to prepare on Friday night to get myself set to be open for Saturday morning. And then I followed up by being here on Saturday morning. I've been here over 700 Saturdays in a row. It's a real yoga. That's an alignment that Paleolithic men would have been glad to have. That's a kind of a Stonehenge where the heel stone is many decades back in the past. I navigate history really well because my rudder is back about 35 years now. I'm not afraid of storms anymore. I know they're bad, but like Conrad's novel Typhoon, I know I'm going to get through. I'm going to get kicked around. 100-foot waves will kick you, but it'll pass. So I prepare Friday night to be open. I arrive here Saturday to be here. And then later on, Saturday afternoon, I just let it play in any way that it wants to. And then on Sunday, I listen to a tape. So I make a weekend out of it. It's a very cheap weekend. It's only, with the tape, $35. Esalen is $800 for a weekend. I make a whole weekend out of it so that I can get all the juice. And by doing that, every week now, for a couple of decades, I've found that I can see far enough to see that freedom is real and that love is effective. And that neither of them are alien to me. And whatever possibility I seek to be. Let's close today with two examples. Two different styles of journey. We have a pair of books, we can take either of which to synthesize the whole year of differential consciousness. One of them is the masculine journey of Virgil's Aeneid. The other is the feminine journey of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Here's a short couple of lines from the male version of the journey, which is a journey of confrontational energies needing to interpenetrate by a conflict. Whereas the Canterbury Tales is the feminine form, where it's not a conflict situation, but it's a resonant scattering of insight. Here's Virgil and then Chaucer. But having paid her final rites as due, the mound among her tomb in order, pious Aeneas, when the heavy seas have stilled, sets out his sails to voyage, quits the harbor, night falls, the winds breathe fair, the brilliant moon does not deny his way. The waters gleam beneath the quivering light. The Trojans sail close by the shore of Circe's island, where the wealthy daughter of the sun, with song unending, fills her inaccessible groves. She kindles fragrant cedarwood within her handsome halls to light the night and runs across her fine-spun web with a shrill shuttle. The raging groans of lions fill her palace. They roar at midnight, restless in their chains, and growls of bristling boars and pent-up bears, and howling from the shapes of giant wolves, all of whom the savage goddess Circe changed by overwhelming herbs out of the likenesses of men into the face and forms of beasts. It's like the island of Dr. Moreau. Here's the feminine version by Chaucer, a whole different mode. I know that Abraham was a holy man, and Jacob too, so far as I can tell. And they had more than 2 wives, both of them, and many another holy man as well. Now, can you tell me where in any age Almighty God explicitly forbade all marrying and giving in marriage? Answer me that. And will you please tell me, where was it he ordained virginity? No fear, you know as well as I do, that the apostle, when he speaks of maidenhood, says he got no firm precept for it. You may advise a woman not to wed, but to our own private judgment he left it. Had virginity been the Lord's command, marriage would at the same time be condemned. And surely, if no seed were ever sown, from what then could virginity be grown? Paul did not dare command, at any rate, a thing for which the Lord gave no edict. There's a prize set up for virginity. Let's see who'll make the running and with whom. Chaucer.